Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gabriel Wilensky, and I am the author of the book 6 Million Crucifixions: How Christian Teachings About Jews Paved the Road to the Holocaust. Today we're going to be covering about 2,000 years of history, but we're going to go very quickly over that. And the focus is going to be specifically on one particular aspect of teachings that led to a feeling of animosity toward Jews that eventually led to the Holocaust. So to get started, I would like you to ask yourselves one particular question. What would it take to get you to travel to a town in a faraway land, drag all the people to a forest nearby, and kill them at point-blank range, one by one, until all were dead? I grappled with this question since I was a teenager. There had to be something beyond Nazi racial propaganda to explain why the Germans and their helpers hated Jews so much. Hitler understood that he had to speak to the masses in language that they could easily relate to and understand. When I was a little boy, a friend in school told me that the Jews were the killers of Jesus. Just like me, Germans had heard all their lives that the Jews were Christ killers and evil. Finally comprehending this motivated to write my book, 6 Million Crucifixions, a book that traces the history of anti-Semitism in Christianity and the role that played in the Holocaust. Maybe you also wondered about this, and I hope that today's talk helps you understand this too. Our story begins shortly after the death of Jesus, when his followers began distancing themselves from mainstream Jews. What began as squabbling between religious sects had snowballed into hatred by the time the Jewish war with the Roman Empire. That culminated in the destruction and sacking of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era. Both mainstream Jews and early Christians began to magnify and create differences amongst themselves. They felt that they had to do this because the early Christians felt that they had to show the Romans that they were different and distinct from the Jews. They did this because obviously the Jews and the Romans had fought a major war, and therefore they didn't want to to be associated with the Jews. And this also applied to the Gentiles, the population outside of Judea, to what is today Israel, who also were trying to adopt the new creed, the new teachings of this new sect, and neither they wanted to be associated with the Jews in front of the Romans. Now, most of the Jews of Galilee or Judea, let alone those who already lived in the diaspora, knew Jesus. And most who did not recognize him as the Messiah. To his followers, this could only mean that either Jesus was not the Messiah or the Jews were wrong. The early Christians, unable to accept the former, chose the latter. The early church introduced the theological concept of supersessionism, or replacement theology. In this new theological understanding, the Christians became the new chosen people, the new Israel, or God's new favorite. Christianity replaced Judaism, which was no longer valid and had lost its place in the world. God abandoned the chosen people, and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and further dispersion in the year 70 was proof of it, at least was understood to be proof of it. Christians began calling the Christian Bible the New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament. And this was used as an example of the new covenant that God had with the new Christian sect, and that replaced the old covenant with the Jews. The images that we see here are the common allegorical figures representing the replacement of the synagogue by the church. We see that the church is typically wearing a crown, carries a cross, and holds a chalice, representing the Redeemer's blood. The superseded synagogue, on the other hand, is always a blindfolded figure, the blindfold representing the blindness and ignorance of the Jewish people, and is often represented with its crown falling from its head, with an inclined head, its staff broken, and the tablets of the law, which are upside down, falling from her hand. Deicide is the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus. Ultimately, this is an amendment to the real charge leveled against the Jews, namely, that they refused to accept the new Christian faith. This was a slanderous accusation, as it was the Romans who tortured and executed Jesus as a political subversive. However, in Christian writings on art, the Jews were commonly portrayed as guilty of the scourging and crucifixion. In these medieval illustrations, we see Jews, which are recognizable by their conical hats, scourging and bringing Jesus to a Roman Pilate, who ironically is also portrayed as a Jew. The accusation of deicide was perhaps the most pernicious teaching about Jews in Christianity and brought untold misery to Jews for almost 2 millennia. During the Nazi era, the anti-Semitic propaganda of the period often used religious terminology and imagery that everyone could understand and relate to. We see here a Nazi propaganda poster from the 1930s accusing the Jews of killing Jesus, of ritual murder, of rejecting him, and of being an enemy of Christianity. The Nazi portrayal of Judaism as pernicious to the Christian mind and as bent on destroying Christianity was inherited from hundreds of years of Christian teachings. It's important to point out that one of the prerequisites for genocide is that the perpetrators feel that they are acting in self-defense. They also feel that they are acting in the self-defense against an implacable foe, one that is really hard to beat. Nazis always presented the battle with the Jews as one of self-defense. Now, by the Middle Ages, the original intra-Jewish sect animosity had become full-blown hatred. Christian thinkers produced a new and separate theology that defined itself, in part, as everything Judaism was not. During this time, Jews were accused of all the ills of the world. They were accused of ritually murdering Christian boys to extract their blood to make Passover bread. They were accused of desecrating the host. They were accused of poisoning wells. And when the Black Plague hit Europe, decimating about a third of the population of the continent in the 14th century, Christians everywhere, who already believed that Jews were already poisoning wells and were bent on destroying Christianity, immediately concluded that the Jews had to be responsible for the Black Plague. This, of course, is preposterous, because Jews were dying just as much as any Christian was. That didn't stop Christians from believing this, though. In these medieval illustrations, we see Christians taking revenge on Jews by burning them alive for allegedly bringing the Black Plague. The Catholic Church initially established the Inquisition to target heretics, but it was soon aimed at the Jews, as they were increasingly seen as not that much different from heretics. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council expressly called upon the secular powers to exterminate all heretics. This provision was the basis for a wave of secular stake burnings during the Inquisition. In 1257, Pope Alexander IV issued a bull officially identifying usury with heresy and placed it under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. As Jews were commonly associated with usury, from this point on, the Inquisition associated the Jews officially with heresy. The Inquisition pursued and enforced racial anti-Semitism since the Middle Ages. What we see in this image is the Inquisition burning a heretic alive on the stake, surrounded by Catholic priests ready to save his soul if he accepted Jesus as his savior before he died. Now, just a few centuries after the Holy Inquisition's tradition of burning Jews alive at the stake, during the Middle Ages, the SS burned Jewish prisoners alive during World War II. The Germans often locked Jews in barns and synagogues everywhere along the Eastern Front and burned them alive. This was just one of the many exterminationist methods that they used. As an SS man testified in reference to the actions of his killing squad in Latvia in the Einsatzgruppen trial in Nuremberg, and I quote, "They brought 8 men and women, with them. The Latvians guarded the Jews, while Harter and Hauser erected a funeral pyre with their own hands. The Jews were bound, put on the pile alive, drenched with gasoline, and burned." It's important to point out that the extermination of the Jews was orchestrated by the Germans, but was carried out with the eagerly offered help of the Christian French, Latvians, Austrian, Slovaks, Croats, Hungarians, Romanians, Ukrainians, Poles, and others. After the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era, a new rabbinic movement led to a rich oral tradition of study, commentary, legal teachings, and instruction of the Hebrew Bible. The compilation of those oral traditions and subsequent rabbinic interpretations and commentaries is known as the Talmud. After the church had discovered and understood that Jews had gone beyond the teachings of the Hebrew Bible and that modern Judaism was based on the teachings of the Talmud, it began attacking the Jewish holy book. In the church's view, the existence of a post-biblical Talmudic Judaism made no sense, as it no longer served the Augustinian purpose of being witnesses to the Old Testament legacy that gave birth to the New Testament and Christianity. The Inquisition soon started to investigate the Talmud, and not surprisingly, found it to be blasphemous and heretical. Pope Gregory IX was convinced that the Talmud was the chief cause that holds the Jews obstinate in their perfidy. The church felt that if the Talmud was destroyed, the Jews would see the truth about the fulfillment arguments from the Hebrew Bible. Subsequently, the church invaded Jewish homes and synagogues to confiscate all copies of the Talmud in places like Paris, Rome, and others, and burn them in huge bonfires that raged for days. Now, if you've ever seen how quickly paper burns, you will probably imagine how much paper you need to burn in order to have a huge bonfire raging for days. 700 years later, the Germans also burned all Jewish books and other printed materials they considered un-German or dangerous. During Christianity's first 1,000 years, Christians were exposed to intense anti-Semitism in their holy texts, the writings of the church fathers, and clerical sermons. In the Christian Bible, the Jews are presented in the worst possible light. Jews are portrayed as bloodthirsty, hateful, and guilty of crucifying Jesus. Jesus and his disciples are presented as different and separate from the Jews. The Gospels often refer to the Jews and not to any specific one or ones. The Gospels establish the association of the Jews with the devil. Keep in mind that just in the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospels, there are about 450 anti-Semitic verses, which amounts to an average of 2 per page. The church fathers, who laid the foundation of Christianity as we know it today, wrote things like, and I quote, "The synagogue is not only a whorehouse and a theater, it is also a den of thieves and a haunt of wild animals. No better disposed than pigs or goats, the Jews live by the rules of debauchery and inordinate gluttony. Only one thing they understand, to gorge themselves and get drunk." This was sent by the Bishop of Antioch, John Chrysostom, in the year 386 of the Common Era. This man was later made a saint of the Catholic Church. The Jews are the most, here's another one. The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, greedy, rapacious. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. They worship the devil. Their religion is a sickness. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jews must live in servitude forever. God always hated the Jews. It is essential that all Christians hate them. These words were said by Saint Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan in the year 374 of the Common Era. These are just examples. There's many more, actually, unfortunately. In the year 1095, gangs of people led by adventurers, ex-priests, and inferior monks went on the first of several crusades to liberate the Holy Land from the Saracens. The first crusade was launched by Pope Urban II. The cross on which Jesus died provided the name and the ideology to the events. Thinking of the crucifixion led Christians to seek vengeance for those that they believed to be responsible for it. The Crusaders declared in clear anti-Jewish theology, and I quote, "You are the children of those who killed our object of veneration, hanging him from a tree. And he himself said, 'There will yet come a day when my children will come and avenge my blood.' We are his children, and it is therefore obligatory for us to avenge him, since you are the ones who rebel and disbelieve him." Godfrey of Bouillon, who led the first crusade, swore, and I quote, "to avenge the blood of Christ on Israel, and to leave no single member of the Jewish race alive." As the mob fell on the Jews of Rouen, Metz, and then the Rhineland with the war cry, "Baptism or death," they murdered tens of thousands of Jews, even eliminating entire communities. This was about 1,000 years before the Holocaust. As the first Crusader stampede trampled on Jews in the 11th century, they did so on what they imagined Jews to be, and not what they really were. This imaginary picture of the Jews was the result of their portrayal of the Jews as still murdering Jesus in Jerusalem in the permanent present tense of the liturgy repeated year after year. Keep in mind that for most Europeans, they had never had any close encounter with Jews. They had never even seen one because there were so few of them. This was also true of the Germans during World War II. So what they knew of Jews was really not based on their personal experience of dealing with a neighbor. It was just hearsay and what they heard in church and other places. We see in these illustrations from a 13th century French Bible, Crusaders killing Jews, which are identifiable by their conical hats. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 decreed that Jews were to live in confined quarters and wear distinctive clothing. By 1555, Paul IV articulated these and other restrictions and enforced them forcefully. Never before had such language been officially promulgated by a pope. He decreed that a walled quarter, which is to say a ghetto, had to be erected in every city which all the Jews were to live, segregated from the Christian community. Jews were to have just one synagogue, and they were banned from constructing others. And any other ones already built were to be demolished. Jews could not own any buildings, and they were forced to sell to Christians any properties that they may have already owned. Jews were prohibited from having nurses, housekeepers, or other Christian servants. Jews were prohibited from playing, eating, or fraternizing with Christians. Jews were not allowed to be addressed as superiors, even by poor Christians. Jews were not allowed to rent houses or businesses outside of the ghetto unless they had special permission from the cardinal vicar. Jews could not acquire real estate outside of the ghetto. Jews could not pursue higher education. Jews were prohibited from holding office. Jews were prohibited from being lawyers, druggists, notaries, painters, and architects. Any physicians among them were prohibited from attending to or taking care of Christians. The latter would continue until the 17th century, when the clergy of Württemberg would say, and I quote, "It is better to die with Christ than to be cured by a Jew doctor aided by the devil." This anti-Jewish papal bull is very important because both the language and the content are an almost literal antecedent to the anti-Jewish legislation that the Germans, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the French passed in the 1930s. The 1860 photograph that we see on the left shows a typical narrow street in the Roman ghetto, literally across the Tiber River from the Vatican. The Roman ghetto was largely demolished and the Jews freed after the Italian secular authorities took over from the Vatican in 1870. The right photo shows one of the currently walled-up gates to the ghetto. Of course, the Nazis, who were as eager to eliminate the Jews from their midst as their Christian predecessors, also established ghettos in most major cities where hundreds of thousands of Jews were confined and where many would die of starvation and illness. As Cardinal Edward Cassidy said many years after the war, and I quote, "The ghetto, which came into being in 1555 with a papal bull, became in Nazi Germany the antechamber to the extermination." These are pictures of the Warsaw and Lodz ghettos in Poland. The sign at the entrance of the ghetto reads, "Jewish residential area, entrance forbidden." The expulsion of the Jews from most of the European countries in which they lived marked the beginning of an attempt at elimination. These expulsions were theologically, racially, and economically driven. Typically, medieval kings would order the expulsion of the Jews after having arrested them, despoiled them of their vestments and money, and subsequently confiscated all their houses, fields, and other immovable property. In a pattern designed to enrich the crown, the Jews later were readmitted into the country, and the cycle would start again sometime after that. We see on the left a 1492 decree issued by Spain's Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, in which they proclaimed, and I quote, "We have been informed by the inquisitors that the mingling of Jews with Christians leads to the worst evils. The Jews try their best to seduce the new Christians, persuading them to follow the law of Moses. In consequence, our holy Catholic faith is debased and humbled. We have thus arrived at the conclusion that the only efficacious method to put an end to this evil consists in the definitive breaking of all relations between Jews and Christians, and this can only be obtained by their expulsion from our kingdom." On the illustration on the right, we see the expulsion of the Jews from Frankfurt in August 1614. If the expulsion of the Jews from most of European countries in which they lived marked the beginning of an attempt at elimination, then the Germans' extermination of 2/3 of European Jewry certainly concluded it. Here we see the Nazis deporting Jews from the Frankfurt area in May 1942 to the Majdanek and Sobibor concentration camps, where they were gassed immediately. During the Middle Ages, various Catholic councils and popes decreed that Jews were an evil influence on Christians, and thus Christians needed to avoid them. The church then established the ghettos where Jews were segregated. They also mandated that Jews wore special clothing to distinguish them from Christians. Jewish women were forced to wear a yellow shawl, and men were forced to wear a yellow conical hat or a yellow badge on their clothes. The conical hat was meant to resemble a horn to further strengthen the association of the Jew with the devil. By the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, they found that they had little left to invent in their campaign against the Jews. The German anti-Jewish laws, the ghettos, the imposition of a distinguishing mark on their clothing had all been previously established by the church. We see on the left a Nazi propaganda poster depicting a stereotypical Jew wearing the yellow Star of David. The text reads, "He is guilty for the war." A form of particularly offensive slander common in Christian Europe was the depiction of the Jews allegedly performing obscene acts with a pig, as seen in these Judensau engravings from the early 17th century. Judensau is German for Jewish sow. These illustrations and sculptures were commonly found everywhere in Europe, including in cathedrals. In these illustrations, we see a horned devil, himself wearing a medieval Jewish badge, encouraging Jewish men, also wearing Jewish clothes and insignia, to pleasure themselves with a sow and eat its excrement, while a Jewish child sucks its teats. Also, a Jewish woman rides a goat, another symbol of the devil. On the left, we see the Cologne Cathedral in Germany in 1937. There is a Judenschau in the underside of a choir stall seat in the cathedral, which is probably the earliest example of this. On the right, we see a Judenschau sculpture in the Wittenberg Cathedral, where Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses in 1517, launching the Protestant movement. The sculpture that we see there is one of the few that still remain in Europe, as most were removed for obvious reasons. Luther would later write, among much other viciously anti-Semitic things, and I quote, "Know, my dear Christian, and do not doubt that next to the devil, you have no enemy more cruel, more venomous, and virulent than a true Jew." In the year 1144, in Norwich, in England, a new and notorious allegation was concocted accusing Jews of ritually murdering Christian boys to obtain blood to make Passover bread. This blood libel spread like wildfire and led to multiple instances of persecution and torture of Jews every time a Christian boy disappeared or his body was found. This accusation was related to the alleged murder lust of the Jews and their bloodthirstiness, based on the conception that Jews hated Christianity and humankind in general. This medieval illustration depicts a cabal of Jewish men extracting the blood of Christian boys. And on the floor, you can see some corpses already. Here we have two modern examples of the ritual murder accusation as reported by the anti-Semitic publication Der Stürmer during the Nazi period. On the left, we see the May 1939 edition with the headline, "Ritual Murder," showing a reprint of the same medieval depiction of a purported ritual murder committed by Jews. The May 1934 edition on the right, with the headline, "Jewish Murder Plan Against Gentile Humanity Revealed," shows a contemporary rendition of the same thing. Adolf Hitler was born and raised as a Catholic. As a young man, he wanted to become an abbot, although later in his life he did not believe in God anymore. As he was never excommunicated, he officially died as a Catholic as well. In May 1945, after having learned of Hitler's death, Cardinal Bertram of Breslau ordered that a solemn requiem mass be held in commemoration of the Führer, so that the almighty son, Hitler, be admitted to paradise. By the time Hitler began his political career, he realized the importance of projecting an image of religiosity. In his public speeches, he made a point to establish a providential connection between him, his work, and God, as well as remark on the religious support for his fight against the Jews. On the Nazi propaganda poster, we see Hitler in religious imagery ordinary Germans could relate to and understand, mirroring the dove that descended on Jesus when John the Baptist baptized him. What appears to be an eagle hovers against the light of heaven over a messianic Hitler. On the right, we see Hitler praying at the end of a rally in Vienna. The understanding that Hitler was on a divine mission was generalized in Germany. Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command, said in distinctly Christian terms, and I quote, "God gave the Savior to the German people. We have faith, deep and unshakable faith, that Hitler was sent to us by God to save Germany." And the Protestant German Christians group expressed, "In the person of the Führer, we behold the one sent from God, who places Germany in the presence of the Lord of history." Hitler understood that to conquer the German masses, he would have to appear not only religious, but also friendly to the churches. He often praised them in public and appeared in or around churches. Hitler was well aware of the church's long-standing anti-Jewish record. In a meeting with Bishop Berning and Monsignor Steinman in April 1933, he complained, and I quote, "I have been attacked because of my handling of the Jewish question. The Catholic Church considered the Jewish pestilent for 1,500 years, put them into ghettos, etc., because it recognized the Jews for what they were. In the epoch of liberalism, the danger was no longer recognized. I am moving back toward the time in which a 1,500-year-old tradition was implemented. I do not set race over religion, but I recognize the representatives of this race as pestilent for the state and for the church, and perhaps I am thereby doing Christianity a great service for pushing them out of schools and public functions. The Catholic Church has expressed in modern times that Nazism was a neo-pagan movement and claimed that Nazi anti-Semitism had its roots outside Christianity. This is not so. Even though Nazism may have been a neo-pagan movement, the vast majority of its followers remained within the Christian faith. Christian anti-Semitism is the foundation on which Nazi anti-Semitism was built. Despite Catholic Church's official line, the roots of Nazi anti-Semitism are indisputably inside Christianity. Under the Weimar Republic, Catholic organizations of every kind multiplied in Germany. New monasteries were built, new religious orders were founded, and new schools were established. As the historian Karl Bachem said in 1931, I quote, "Never yet has a Catholic country possessed such a developed system of all conceivably Catholic associations as today's Catholic Germany." This was just 2 years before the Nazis were elected to power in Germany. Despite neo-pagan claims and Nazi efforts to eliminate Christianity from Germany, as late as 1944, just 1 year before the conclusion of the war, only 3.5% of the population described themselves as neo-pagan. Despite all pressures to leave the church, even among the SS, almost a fourth remained in the Catholic faith. By 1940, over 95% of the German population were still tax-paying members of their respective Protestant and Catholic churches. In these photographs, we see Nazi brown shirts attending church. Church attendance was a very common private and official practice during the Nazi period. In these photographs, we see Nazis attending Berlin Cathedral to celebrate Hitler's birthday in 1933. Indisputably, Christianity was, before and during the war, the powerful common denominator that permeated German society at all levels, and the indelible identity that anchored the ordinary German. On the left, we see a roadside cross commonly found everywhere along roads in 1930s Germany. The accusation of deicide was fully incorporated in the Christian psyche by the time the Nazis came to power. The illustration on the right is from the anti-Semitic German children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom, which was very common at that time. As this German mother explains to her children in the caption, and I quote, "When you see a cross, then think of the horrible murder by the Jews on Golgotha." Even though the Vatican objected to certain aspects of Nazi ideology and considered it a heresy, the German Catholic Church and the various German Protestant churches wholeheartedly embraced it. Until Hitler took power in 1933, the Catholic Church banned all Germans, all Catholic faithful, from joining the Nazi Party. Shortly after, the Vatican signed a concordat with the Nazi regime. A concordat is a treaty. After that, the German Catholic Church lifted the ban, and after that, millions of German Catholics, joined the party in droves. Not even after it was clear what the Nazis stood for did the church admonish the faithful to refrain from following any immoral orders. Throughout the entire Nazi period, clerics from both the Catholic and Protestant churches showed support for Hitler and Nazi policies. And they did this in a number of different ways. They did it by regularly appearing with the Nazis, by regularly admonishing the faithful to obey Hitler, by regularly praising Hitler and his policies, by regularly supporting the persecution of the Jews, and by providing material assistance in the hunt for Jews, by providing the government with baptismal records, which allowed the government to identify who was a Jew. Keep in mind that in Germany, as opposed to Eastern Europe, Jews were very hard to identify because they dressed like any regular German, they spoke like any regular German, and they were highly assimilated. They did not have special garments, long beards, and so on, like the Eastern European Jews. So the Nazis had a hard time identifying who was a Jew, and the church helped them to do this. Archbishop Gruber declared to an enthusiastic audience that he gave his complete and wholehearted support to the new government and the new Reich. Bishop Berning declared that German bishops not only accepted and recognized the new state, but served it with ardent love and with all our strength. Cardinal Bertram addressed German Catholics in his diocese in Breslau in 1938, 3 years after the Nuremberg anti-Jewish laws had been passed. He invoked scriptures to support the Nazi regime. He said, "There is no need to urge you to give respect and obedience to the new authorities of the German state. You all know the words of the apostle. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities." Bishop Vornewasser from Trier exhibited the seamless robe as an exceptional show of support. The tunic had not been exhibited to the faithful since 1891. He declared to a congregation of Catholic youth in Trier Cathedral that, and I quote, "With raised heads and firm step, we have entered the new Reich, and we are prepared to serve it with all the might of our body and soul." Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer from the Confessing Church also displayed theological anti-Judaism, and I quote, "The state's measures against the Jewish people are connected in a very special way with the church," he declared. "In the Church of Christ, we have never lost sight of the idea that the chosen people who nailed the Savior of the world to the cross must bear the curse of the action through a long history of suffering. Medieval Christian thinkers began asking themselves what kind of rational creature would deliberately reject the truth and kill God. They concluded that only someone who was an irrational and inhuman agent of Satan could act that way. As preposterous as this sounds to us today, in the medieval Christian mind, Jews were literally conceived of as inhuman, demonic creatures. They used Satan's weapons to fight the forces of truth and salvation. Keep in mind that for Christians familiar with biblical imagery, for example, from John 8, where Jesus tells the Jews, "You belong to your father, the devil," they had no difficulty in accepting this. The conviction that Jews work together with the devil explains how it was possible to accept a priori every accusation against the Jews, regardless of how preposterous it was. On the left illustration, we see a detail from a 1475 German anti-Semitic painting portraying the devil wearing a Jewish badge, and complete with horns and tail and hooves, actually. On the right is the February 1943 edition of the anti-Semitic publication Der Stürmer. The caption of the photograph of the stereotypical Eastern European Jew reads, "Satan." At the bottom of the page is the ubiquitous Nazi slogan, "The Jews are our misfortune," which echoes Martin Luther's, "The Jews are for us a heavy burden, the calamity of our being. They are like a plague, a pestilence, pure misfortune in our country." The association of Jews with the devil, which had been pervasive in Christendom for centuries, found expression on many outlets during the Nazi period. The Nazi propaganda machine spoke to the German people in familiar language that they understood and they could easily relate to. Otto Ollendorf, the commander of a mobile killing squad that slaughtered 90,000 Jews in the Soviet Union, wrote to his wife after the war, and I quote, "Jewry has continued to sow hate, and it reaps hate again. How else could one see it as anything but the work of demons who waged their battle against us?" The photograph on the left is from a roadside warning sign found in Germany during the Third Reich. It reads, Jews in the Blosersberg community are not welcome. To know the Jew is to know the devil. The photograph on the right, in the center, shows a sign in the countryside in Eschenbach in central Franconia in Germany in July 1935, and that reads, "The father of the Jew is the devil." In smaller type, you cannot see it here, but in smaller type underneath that, it reads, "Jesus Christ." Now, what were those peasant children supposed to think? With this kind of indoctrination, can we really blame them for what they did later in their lives? The photograph on the right shows an anti-Jewish sign posted on a street in Dresden. It reads, "The Jews are the children of the devil." Below the large sign are two smaller ones that read, "The Jews are our misfortune." Anti-Semitism in Germany was also directed specifically to children, like the propaganda aimed at adults, the use of language with a religious tenor in magazines, billboards, and books was critical to clearly impress the tender reader's mind. For example, the notorious anti-Semite Julius Streicher said in a speech, "Without a solution to the Jewish question, there will be no salvation for mankind." Both of these illustrations that we see here are from the children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom. The one on the left shows a billboard announcing a talk by Streicher. It tells the German children that the Jews are our misfortune and that those who are fighting against the Jews are struggling against the devil. At a real-life gathering during Christmas of 1936 in Nuremberg, Julius Streicher addressed 2,000 children. He asked them, "Do you know who the devil is?" And 2,000 children's voices replied, "The Jew, the Jew." Another story in The Poisonous Mushroom tells of a German girl who is waiting to be examined by a Jewish doctor. And I quote, "Her eyes stare into the face of the Jewish doctor, and his face is the face of the devil. In the middle of this devil's face is a huge crooked nose. Behind the spectacles, two criminal eyes. And the thick lips are grinning, a grinning that expresses, 'Now I've got you at last, you little German girl.'" The children learning these things in the 1930s were the young soldiers, SS, policemen, and local auxiliaries who willingly and eagerly denounced, hunted down, tortured, and murdered Jews during the 1940s. How else could they have acted? Who would not eagerly kill the devil? The Holocaust forces us to seek answers to tough questions. What motivated the perpetrators to so willingly round up, deport, and slaughter thousands of people in the most hellish way? Why was it that they did not excuse themselves from this task when their commanders gave them the choice and when there was no consequence to do so? Why was it that they willingly took pictures of themselves and their victims to share with their friends and family back home? The picture on the right is an example of that. These are not actions of reluctant functionaries, blindly obeying orders. Their willingness, and in most cases eagerness, to exterminate Jews, and to do so in the ways they did, was predicated on the basis of a profound, visceral hatred toward Jews instilled in them almost from the moment that they could understand language. A hatred that went much deeper than the racial propaganda of the day. The Germans and their helpers went far beyond because they felt the Jews were guilty of monstrous crimes and they were dangerous. They exterminated Jews because they felt that they were defending themselves from what they perceived to be a demonic influence on their Christian way of life. The perpetrators inflicted unspeakable pain and suffering on their victims and then killed them because, aside from their racial hatred that made them think that they were eliminating a subhuman species, they were also taking revenge for allegedly causing capitalism, communism, revolution, the defeat in World War I, unemployment, economic depression, taking the best jobs, and any other number of baseless accusations, all successors in modern guise and lexicon of the ancient Christian accusations of ritual murder, causing the Black Plague, associating with the devil, poisoning wells, desecrating the host, rejecting Christian revelation, defiling Christian minds, and killing Christ. Did the priests assigned to the German armed forces admonish the faithful to refrain from murdering Jews, as this was a crime and a mortal sin? The answer is no. They did not do that. Instead, they provided group absolution and succor to the soldiers. Catholic military Bishop Rakowski was the spiritual leader of the priests assigned to the German armed forces. Did he instruct the priests to admonish the faithful to refrain from murdering Jews, as this was a crime and a mortal sin? Again, the answer is no. Instead, he blamed Jews for the war and all of Germany's misfortunes, and instructed the priests to admonish the flock to blindly follow orders, reminding them that behind all this stands God himself with his will and command, and also telling them that they should obey the Führer out of holiest conviction of conscience. Sometimes the sermons from regular priests were quite explicit. On a Sunday sermon in May 1942 in Kowal in Poland, the priest gave clear guidance to his flock. I quote, "No trace of a Jew is to remain. We should erase them from the face of the earth." As is to be expected, this led the perpetrators of the Holocaust to think that they were doing the right thing, and that it was God's will. As a daily and constant reminder, their belt buckles had the inscription, "God with us," stamped on it. We can see this on the upper left image. The photograph on the lower left shows a religious service for German soldiers, which of course was very common everywhere along the front. The photographs on the right show the military chaplains assigned to the special units that went behind the army on the Eastern Front and whose responsibility was to round up and kill all Jews in every town along the front. The men we saw murdering the mother and the child and the naked women in a ravine on the previous page came from units like these ones. The upper right photograph shows the machine gun used by the unit to murder Jews lined up on the edge of mass graves. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a military chaplain standing amongst them. The lower right photo shows the military chaplain before or after the religious service, cleansing the souls of these men. The Nuremberg trial set the legal precedent of accusing someone of incitement and of using hateful speech. But if Julius Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, was accused of leading the education of the German people in perverse ways, of concentrating on the youth and childhood of Germany, of injecting poison in the minds of millions of Germans, so could the church. However, in this picture of a trial of major war criminals, emblematic of justice, we do not see any cleric who may have been guilty of crimes before, during, or after the war. Had it not been for the Stürmer and its publisher, German fascism would not have been able to educate in such short period of time those mass murderers who put into effect the criminal plans of Hitler and his thugs by murdering almost 6 million Jews. And had it not been for Christianity's teachings about Jews, there would not have been a Der Stürmer, a Streicher, or a Hitler. Bishop Angelo Roncalli, who had fought tirelessly to save Jews during the war, became Pope John the 23rd after the wartime Pope, Pius XII, died in 1958. John the 23rd removed the term perfidious Jews from the Good Friday prayer and subsequently renounced all negative references to Jews, such as the allusions to their veiled hearts and blindness. In 1962, almost 20 years after the Holocaust, he convened the Second Vatican Council. The result was the Nostra Aetate Declaration, which stated that the crucifixion, and I quote, cannot be blamed upon all the Jews then living without distinction, nor upon the Jews of today. In addition to this, the fathers declared that the Jews are not repudiated or cursed by God. These statements mark the beginning of the end of over 1,600 years of Christian anti-Semitism. The Catholic Church, followed shortly afterwards by the Protestant Church, issued instruction to priests on how to teach and discuss Judaism with the faithful. In 1998, after 11 years in the making and more than half a century after the Holocaust, the Vatican, under Pope John Paul II, issued the statement, "We Remember," a reflection on the Shoah. Shoah is the Hebrew term for Holocaust. This was a well-intentioned document that fell short and was mostly apologetic, a defensive apologetic attempt to exonerate the church. In contrast to that, the American Catholic bishops were much more forthright. I quote, "Christian anti-Judaism did lay the groundwork for racial, genocidal anti-Semitism by stigmatizing not only Judaism but Jews themselves for opprobrium and contempt. So the Nazi theories tragically found fertile soil in which to plant the horror of an unprecedented attempt at genocide. We Remembers call for the Church's ongoing repentance and for these sins against the Jews will involve for most Christians an assumption of responsibility for our collective Christian past." In conclusion, the reason for the peoples of Europe developed the ideas of modern anti-Semitism, succeeded in disseminating them so quickly, and felt no compunction in collaborating in the execution of the final solution to the Jewish question, is because as the inheritors of a legacy of 1,600 years of Christian anti-Semitism and conditioning, they were already hostile towards Jews, that they already believed that there was indeed a Jewish question that had to be resolved. The Christian population was predisposed to absorb any new idea that conformed to a worldview in which Jews were malevolent, hateful, and perceived to be dangerous, and which provided them with a way to eliminate the perceived problem. Even though other elements contributed to the fantastic notions that Germans and others held about Jews, the Church's anti-Semitism was a necessary, although not sufficient, cause for the extermination of the Jews during the Second World War. As Roberto Farinacci, a member of Mussolini's fascist Grand Council, said, and I quote, "It comforts our souls to know that if as Catholics we became anti-Semites, we owe it to the teachings that the Church has promulgated over the past 20 centuries." Thank you very much.